Um, so today I'm going to talk to you guys a little bit about contextual data management in React. So a little bit about me. My name is Russell Skaggs, and I honestly spend a lot more time on the UI UX side of React more so than a lot of the heavy data structures. But there, specifically while working on component libraries, I ran into some issues and helped resolve those with teams that we would be working with to integrate. But I guess before I get too far into the weeds, I do want to take a moment to kind of thank the Code PaLOusa sponsors, especially with this being kind of a difficult year financially for everyone with COVID, and kind of like what I mentioned in my earlier session, like I don't even think these companies are getting the benefit of trying to poach each other's developers that attended. So extra special kudos. Though I am sad that I wouldn't see what would be at the Amazon Alexa booth in person, but times are the way they are, and I am very grateful for their support of this conference. So I started talking about this a little bit, but kind of going deeper. So when I say that I was more interested in the UI UX side, that predates React. My background has definitely been more of an HTML, CSS person who used JavaScript when and only I could not make the HTML and CSS do what I needed to do without it. I've since become a huge JavaScript fan and love it, and have constantly been falling more in love with it. But with that background, I had a bit of a love-hate relationship with React from the get-go. Being kind of a markup purist, I hated the idea of JSX. I found it almost offensive from my technical virtues of separating out the HTML from the JavaScript. And really, if I had to define the thing that got me into React the most, I will probably say that it was spite, because I did know JavaScript, and there was a time where I was working, where I was interviewing with a company, and the React skills, and not just one company too, and the React specific framework was a factor in my employment. So later on in my career, I got the opportunity to define my tech stack. I knew that we would be working on a very componentized architecture. And this was really before, while Vue was rising, but before it hit its kind of peak. And I'd done a little bit with Knockout. But when I looked at the options for building a really robust component library that I could, put out to market really quickly for our deliverables, React was the choice that I went with. And like I said, part of it was spite, because I wanted to prove I could do it. But it turns out that it got a lot of things right, especially regarding how it handles JavaScript, in my opinion, with being a more declarative version, whereas at the time, everything was more imperative, subscribing to event listeners, finding everything you need to update, and applying those classes. It's kind of a pain. But I also got into React at a really, really interesting time, because when I got into React, it was right before the context API became official. I believe it was in beta when I started working in React, but it hadn't been released yet. So through my journey of learning React, I experienced 4 major shifts in kind of how we would go about managing our data. First, I just want to do out of the box React stuff. So I started off learning, set state props, all of that kind of class-based React architecture. And it came with some like overhead and pain points that, especially in my role as being more of a the CSS HTML side, didn't really care for. Like the state was huge and monolithic. It was just kind of a single object and a single set state attribute. Following React's recommendations to store like common state at the lowest common ancestor to kind of avoid some of that global storage or that global variable problem sounded good on paper, but it was really hard to implement because it was really prone to a lot of prop drilling in order to pass high-level state down to lower-level components. So I was writing a lot of code that was really hard to nail down and track. So if I had like a basic profile info React component, I may set the state equal to a prop or have another way of defining it, but I'd have to set it up here in the constructor. I think there was another way to do this with another call, but this is the way I had learned and the way the documentation kind of laid it out as a preference. And then I would have to go in and pass all of these, like first name equals this dot state dot first name, or I could also pass it as profile info equals this dot state. But if I needed to actually edit that, then I would also have to either create a custom method on top of the class structure, which, to be honest, like the whole class extend syntax was completely new to me when I was first learning React, because like that's also when I started ramping up on ES6. But yeah, it is something that is possible. But it leads to sort of these weird problems where I may only really want this profile header down here. I may have this profile info because there's a shared common ancestor between edit profile and profile header. But between, there may be one or more bits of components that I would have to make sure that I passed along that piece of code as well. That became very burdensome to maintain, especially if I ever needed to add any new component that would be referencing that. I found myself constantly like moving up and down, moving the state up and down different components as like requirements would get refined and code would get refactored to kind of adhere to React's least or lowest common ancestor guideline. Well, for one of the roles that I was doing using this, I was involved with creating a high fidelity prototype for a user research study. And when I say high fidelity, I mean the workflow needed to be pretty much production level to the point of anything the user input we kept track of. Persisted throughout the experience. We didn't send it into any database, but we did store it locally using state and passing it along. So I finally had enough and realized this wasn't cutting it. So I did what everyone was doing at that time. Redux. Redux has kind of this completely opposite methodology to managing your state. Rather than storing everything at the lowest common ancestor, when you're working with Redux, you store everything on the global level, and sometimes as like an object with different like different properties that would store the different types of data. And for most of the stuff I was working on, this was a definite win over the lowest common ancestor, because at least I had some context to where I would go to update things. And as far as like actually getting that to my components, it solved the prop drilling problem of having to pass it through every ancestor to where it needed to go by creating a connector high order component to map that global store to the props. So like at a high level, because I'm not really great at drawing boxes, the way the Redux pattern works, for those of you that may not be familiar with it, is that the data store, or the store data, I guess either way works, gets passed into the UI as props. Then something on the UI dispatches an action function call to the reducer. And in like Redux, the reason it's called a reducer is because it acts very much the same way the array.reduce function works. And it expects that to be kind of a pure function and get reliable and have reliable output for every for anything you pass in there. And then when the reducer updates the store based on like the values that were passed in through that function call. And then finally, because you connect all this together, you connect the data store to the props in the component. The component sees those props get updated and then triggers a React re-render. So usually this is broken out into kind of multiple files. In this case, we just kind of put like I just put all of the examples here. So inside of like an actions file, you may export a constant that is a set name function that will pass this object into a reducer. When a reducer, what a reducer will do, receives is the state that currently exists, and then the action call. So by calling this and passing a name, we would send this object, and then following this pattern, we would switch off of the action.type to check for the right type, and then make modifications to the state, and being careful to return a new array so that we would never mutate the existing state, which is a big concern when you're dealing with React, because if you mutate an object or an array, React will still see that as the same item because it does like a shallow compare. Whereas like returning a new state, it'll trigger that update correctly. Yeah, so then we have like a component's greeting UI. So this would just be a normal component file, like a presentational component, not having a lot of like a lot of logic built into it. And then following this pattern, there'd usually be like a container component that would map all of this logic. So Redux brought with it this connect function that you could pass two functions to, one to map the state to props in the component, and one to map the dispatch to props in the component. And then this when you call this connect function and then pass in that result with the component, it will sync up the component with these properties being passed. Like I said, this was one of those things when I was dealing with a large set of data, especially when I was dealing with something where I would have a common data store between a lot of different things that I was working on, became super useful, because suddenly, wherever I was able to access my high-level data store information. But it definitely had some of its own quirks. For starters, it felt very difficult for me to navigate, and even now, and in preparation for this talk, I had to go through Redux documentation again just to make sure that I completely grasped it, because at the time it was pretty it was pretty burdensome, and it just felt like having to have 4 files to kind of do a thing was a little bit overkill for some cases. And it also kind of felt a little bit awkward in some places, like if I was just trying to maintain a an accordion, like an accordion state or a tab state, keeping track of things that would be a little bit more local and not so much data store oriented. Then, after I was messing with Redux for a while, we finally got the React looked like my camera froze, so I'll just repeat myself. After I was working with the Redux library for a while, I watched React release Context. And Context was a really great win for the React, for building React applications in a time where Redux might be a little bit overkill. It created providers and consumers components to solve the prop drilling problem, so I didn't have to worry about the components in between. So consumers could access layers data from any layers down. And the states were still like monolithic because it still required that class syntax and that object to kind of handle them. But then you're kind of talking about having like minimal React classes, and you could do a lot of the components that would rely on that logic just using pure functions and tying into that the context.consumers. So in this situation, it would look something like this. So rather than, so going back to my profile info example, rather than passing down the state or any of these props, I just created a profile context provider, or a profile context, and then passed into the provider value my state and my set state function. Now, I'm going to be the first to admit this is not a good practice, and giving all your components inside of there the ability to update the state, maybe not the smartest idea, especially maybe not doing it in such a monolithic way where you could accidentally cause some bugs. But this was super helpful, as I would want to minimize the amount of like classes that I was dealing with, and just kind of accessing some of the state stuff for very basic reference. All right, and then the thing that kind of tied all of this together, and where React's data management really exploded, and to me made it like the framework that I enthusiastically support today, was the release of hooks. So if you aren't familiar with hooks, hooks brought a lot of that state functionality into functional components. It used smaller, tinier states, and it also added a hook called useReducer, which took kind of the best part of Redux and made it kind of natively available for React. And to kind of go into details on what I mean about that a little bit, is that useState kind of updates asynchronously, and it can be a little bit finicky if you need to rely on like a series of useState updates firing in the right order. But when you use the reducer pattern, when you use useReducer, use Redux, everything gets fired and finishes up before the next thing goes. So you have confidence in how those things get fired. So now I really lucked out, because I felt really lucky because I no longer had to care about the class version of React for anything new I would build. I would just have to build define these constants and set them to the value of the use state, which returned and this for the use state returns an array where the first value is the state and the second value is kind of that state setter. So at first it was kind of a weird pattern to use deconstructing like this for state data, but it was valuable, and it's definitely grown on me. So like which method of state management should I use? Well, props are great for like passing simple elements or props or values down to a direct ancestor. And they're also great for things that don't change based on state. For instance, like a great example of this is any like basic HTML attribute is also a prop. So if you were here for my talk on accessibility, if you wanted to define an ARIA role and pass it along, you're probably just going to do that as a prop. Redux still has a good use case, even with the hooks and context, and that like Redux is still really great at handling that global store data, especially if you wanted to embrace a micro front-ends architecture where you could be building something in React, but the other team that you work with could be building something in Vue. I know that micro front-ends, like that's kind of a mixed reaction within the front-end community about whether or not that's the right way to go. But I do know from experience that like working with like when you work with a larger company, different teams often have different preferences and will, depending on the leniency of your IT governance, will make the decision to move forward with like the hot new thing and whatever is the easiest to dev with, for better or worse. And then context is great for, and this is, context I have a special love for, especially with hooks, but even before hooks, context is super great at defining, allowing you to define data in the most appropriate place. You no longer need to worry about this kind of dichotomy between do you declare it like at the local level, the least common ancestor, or do you declare it up in the global store? And to be fair, Redux even put out articles that like you don't need to manage everything in Redux, but you know when you first start looking into that as like a new developer into the pattern, you'll start searching things like how to manage UI state in Redux, and instead of finding the article titled "You don't need to manage everything," you maybe don't need Redux, you'll instead find an article showing you how to manage your UI state in Redux. So, and it's also great with just like consuming data without a lot of maintenance overhead. And when I say maintenance overhead, I mean that you don't have to go through and keep track of any place except where you're defining the data and where you're consuming the data. And then hooks are really great for providing more surgical states, functional lifecycle management, empowering consuming and crossing of contexts, like and enabling sort of like a micro Redux via use reducer. So, okay, so I've talked like 20 minutes on just like the history of kind of these four things that I encountered. And the reason that I thought it was important to kind of go through that is because as I was building out these experiences, these applications, I noticed kind of a trend emerging within my code. Like for me, layers naturally began to split out within my code base. And I'm not sure that every application will necessarily run into the exact same 3 layers because tech is infinite, and the use cases that I did were very highly pulling from a global data store, running through a processor workflow while pulling in UI components. So naturally, the three data sources that I need to keep track of were my global data, my process workflow state, and my UI state data. So talking through that, I think it's time that we can probably dive a little bit back into the code and try to build out one of those workflows using kind of like those 3 levels of data. So because I am a UI person, I will want to go ahead and start with my favorite layer, which is kind of the UI. So here we have in this radiolist.jsx, We have a couple components. We have a radio list and a radio item. In our component library, we've made the decision that we want to package these as kind of an interconnected relationship. So one of the cool things that context really allows you to do is that you can kind of build this subcomponent model where you can start where you can allow the integration side to call those subcomponents and rely on and get properties without the person integrating needing to pass them directly. So looking at like a radio list, we can kind of think through some of the things that we would need off the bat. Like a proper form would need a name. And because radio items would work that way, all items should have the same name to properly pick up in a form submit. Then thinking through some things that we would need is we would probably need to know which, like what is selected. So let's go ahead and create a constant here for selected item, set selected item. And by default, we'll just set this to null. Now, because we need to be able to access whether or not this is selected at this radio item level, we are going to define a context. And we'll just selected item, set selected item. And we'll just go ahead and wrap everything around everything in here with that context provider. And we'll pass in selected item and set selected item. So now down here in this radio item, we kind of have a state defaulted, but we haven't really done much with using it. And the reason that we have this state defined is because, as per typical with designers, you know how they are. We did not get the requirement that allowed us to just use a normal radio item. We have a super fancy radio item to meet our UX and branding guidelines. That means that inputs being notoriously hard to style, we're going to kind of hide within this span and latch on to some of the things that are going on over here to just visually represent that. So we will go ahead and create a handle change event. Handle focus event, and set as focus to true, const handle blur, set has focus to false. And then we also need to change the selected state. So we will pull in that context and grab the selected item and set selected item from use context. And now we can have is checked equals selected item item equals value. So this will return us a Boolean. All right. All right, so we'll go ahead and pull this style down here because this should be down here with the radio item because we're reading this is selected or yeah, it's selected. And we'll also want to do a change event. So handle change where set selected item equals value. All right, so now we can go through and just add these onto this input on focus, handle focus, on blur, on change. All right. Cool. So now we've got our radio list. So when we pull up this, by default, like we have a shell of an app already built where we are loading in screens. And the screen that we are looking at right now and yeah, screen we are looking at right now is over here under event. So we're going to import this radio list from our components radio list. All right, so let's see if it loads or if I broke something, which is pretty normal. Yep, it's pretty normal. All right. Yep. So going back over to radio, we'll need to default these to items because they've not been previously defined. It's really important that I do this in the right folder rather than my cheating and clean folders. So yeah, once again, going back over to radio list and making sure that these are defaulted to null and an empty function. Oh, and as it turns out, we're going to want to pass the name into the context as well. So name empty string, and we'll also grab that here as well. So now we have 3 checkboxes that are handling like the radio state. And looking at this, name equals test. Right, so that was the problem that was happening there. All right. So now, this is all great, but this is just UI level data. We need to integrate this with something. So we've already kind of got one of the things that we can tap into building out this workflow is a data store. So we are going to pretend that this is all pulled from a database, and these are the values we have. And this is a value of an event list with just 3 events used for example. So now we will want to go back into this event, and rather than using this test data, we'll pull in another use context. And we'll also import our store context. And we will use context, and we'll open this back up real quick. Or we will open this back up real quick. And yeah, so unlike a lot of the contexts where we define a full object, we're just defining an array. So in here, this is just an event list, or to be careful, if it returns undefined, an empty array. So let's go ahead and map through this. And we'll just go ahead and use this ID for both the ID and the value, as it's a unique item. And then we will choose the title and also give a price indication so that as it's looped, people will be able to see what they're getting. There we go. All right, so now we can see this. But so we've gotten the store data into this place, but it doesn't do us much good on its own. So we'll need to go into our application and create this other layer to kind of keep track of this particular type of information. So this is more of our transactional information. Throughout this process, we will want to persist that this is what was selected. So once again, we'll hook into a use state. And we've already kind of established an app context. So we will just grab these and toss them in here as well. And then when we go back into the event screen, we can pull in the app context and grab those values. Now you may be wondering why I'm grabbing those values when we're passing them with the when we're handling this state on the UI side. And this is where we're going to maybe be a little sneaky and do override selected item. And we're going to pass this as an array of these two values, just like this was returned from a hook. And now on the UI side, because we do need to care about being able to actually update this with that sort of data, we are going to define this override selected item over in the radio list. And then hijack this use state call with that if it exists. Now, going into the event, we can also pull in, we can also just add a basic H1 choose your event. And then we'll also pull in the button component. And go down here and add this. And next, select tickets. So in order for this to be effective, we'll also want to grab the set current screen. And click what I had defined in over here, tickets. All right, so we'll just copy that over. Now, as we're pulling this information through, we can still see that it's updating. And so the next test is going to be pulling that same information through on the next screen. So tickets being a very similar blank screen, we'll need to pull in some of those other same hooks. So let's just grab all the same references real quick to speed it up. And yeah, I'm actually going to dip into, for time-saving purposes, I am going to dip in to the ticket screen that I had built earlier. And just going to move over this. Move over this and move over this. Yeah, similar thing. So now we will go into the choose your tickets and current event name dot title. Read property title of undefined, current event, current. So yep. Let's go look at this code that I copied over that I broke somewhere between copying it. So current event, so we're defining it. Event list dot define. So we're pulling in the store context where E equals ID of selected event ID. And yep. So like most developers, I'm just going to try to console out the selected event ID real quick. And it's null. All right. Oh, that would make sense. So I copied over some of the code, but as I was live coding it sometimes some of the properties change. So let's just copy over this. And then when we do this, handle change is not defined. Where's it not defined? Components quantity. Oh, yep. So we'll also copy over the quantity cheater code. All right. So the big thing here is when we're walking through this is that I've now been able to I've now been able to move my workflow in context of this application, which is kind of a purchasing app. When I selected this UI component, which maintained a layer of UI state to kind of showcase what a radio button that was checked looked like, we were able to kind of keep that state local to there where it made sense and overwrite it with application-specific data when necessary. Also, the application logic itself didn't really need any information specific to the data store. We left that out of the application part of this because we really didn't need it. We're just keeping track of what values pass along to the end of the workflow. Instead, we leveraged that store at a point of integration on a specific screen where we were tying together these different views. So looking through the, quickly looking through the ticket screen, we kind of, in the updates to the app, we kind of did something similar where we set a quantity. We added it to the context. Inside of this quantity component, we did something very similar where we had a value override and defaulting to a use state. We have a handle change that when the field changes, it will update this set value, which when we're using that override, in turn updates the application state. And then next, we can look at we'll pull over the next screen, a confirmation, where the business logic will start to use this in a little bit different of a way. So in this case, we're buying, let's say we're buying 100 Star Trek tickets. Then we can see a confirmation that with a basic calculator for 100 Star Trek tickets, it'll cost $17,500. Pretty basic calculator, easy to kind of figure out. And then finally, on a success page, we'll do Code PaLOUsa this time because that is, or Code PaLOUsa because that is the conference we're at. We'll grab 15 tickets. We'll confirm that that information exists. So right now we're just keeping track of what the ID. So along this time where we're picking this item, we're only persisting the ID. We're not actually persisting any of the lookups to the store and that object, and we could do that. But I decided to use more of the Redux model of referential storing, so that in any place where I would need to look up a property of that object, I can just use that ID to grab that information instead. So now that we're on the confirmation page, we look up that event, that current event, by querying the event list and finding the right ID. And then we just use those properties with a little bit of math to kind of create this kind of custom unique messaging. And then when we get over here and we confirm that this is the amount of tickets that we want to buy and this is the price we're okay with, we have this similar, your account has been charged $2,250. Now, this is intentionally a very simple workflow for the context of a con talk and demo. But the big takeaway that I found by using this sort of contextual data management is that by really keying in onto React's context API, especially in combination with like a couple of specific hooks, it allowed me to really care about information at the right time. At the data store level, the reason that we have this all the way up at the top is because this is not the only part of the application that would be referencing this event list. This could be one workflow, but there is likely also upcoming events listed elsewhere. And realistically, there would be much more data that would be populated here, like descriptions, date, etc. So this felt like that sort of data that that it's your known quantifiables that you're probably not likely to change unless you're querying a new database where someone entered something. And then drilling down into the application layer, we knew that we wanted to keep track of a couple of key things throughout our entire life cycle to make sure that we could send the messaging and get the confirmations that we wanted. The only thing we cared about was what the event was selected. We cared about the number of tickets that they were purchasing, and we kind of cared about where they were in the workflow. Where they were in the workflow just allowed us to make sure that we were showing them the right visualizations, and then it also enabled us to pull in the right calculated values in the confirmation page, the success page, and the ticket page. Here on the screens, which is kind of where we merge that UI layer with that application logic layer. We're just pulling in data. We're not really setting anything here. We're not really setting any state. This is just where we're consuming from like 3 different sources and shoving everything together. And then in the UI layer, we recognize what needs to be, what values like we actually need in order to get the component to work. And then we also took time to allow a little bit of an integration prop to allow us to kind of override those default hooks. So like in this workflow example, we've leveraged 3 of the 4 major kind of ways of going about like state management in React. And now I will acknowledge there are other third parties like MobX, that like Redux isn't the only third party player in the game, but most of them are more geared towards like more global data stores, from my understanding. So it felt like Redux, I didn't need to go into every third-party state. So will this method work for you? I don't know. I don't really know your use case. I think that the real big takeaway that I wanted to kind of get people thinking about, and this is something that spun off from a workshop when I was going through component libraries and how I manage my state there, is that people were asking how I manage that in context of like Redux and all that. And the reality was that I never managed my state in Redux, or I never managed my UI state in Redux, because that's not the right place to do it. States are very much like ogres or onions. They have layers, and understanding the right layer to apply the right logic and to track the right thing, to me, is one of the best ways to move forward with your application in a way that makes sense and is easy to maintain and debug over time. So I think we're kind of running at time, so I will ask if anyone has any questions. And once again, thanks to the sponsors for putting on this awesome event. And thank you guys for sticking it out. I appreciate you all. Thanks, Tina. Thanks for sticking around. Hopefully this stuff was useful. I know it's always hard to gauge what level an audience is. It's very easy to go way too remedial, but it's also really easy to go like way too advanced. I can probably stick around for a couple. Thanks. I'll probably hang around for a couple more minutes just in case anyone does have questions, and then I will probably hop so I can check out some of these awesome presenters. Thanks, you too. I will take that as silence. I appreciate you all. Enjoy the rest of your conference. Bye.